Hello and welcome to Asbury Seminary Voices. My name is Judah Robinson, and we are sharing stories that are a collection of alumni, student, and faculty stories meant to glorify God and inspire you. Today, we are talking with one of our very own, Dr. Kevin Watson. Dr. Watson, thank you for being with us today and for taking the opportunity to talk with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Judah. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. So can you just maybe to start off, tell us what your title, your position is here at Asbury Seminary, and where you're located, because that's important, and kind of what you do here at the school.
Yeah, so I'm the Director of Academic Growth and Formation, and I am anchored at our Tulsa Extension site. So I'm kind of helping to grow the site here in Tulsa, be attentive to kind of the student experience, building community, but also getting to teach and loving doing that. And I'm also kind of getting to build bridges between the seminary and the church that we have a partnership here in Tulsa, which is Asbury Church. And I'm the scholar in residence at Asbury Church, which has been really fun to kind of be able to strengthen the connection between our seminary and I think kind of a regionally strategic church.
Awesome. Yeah, that's fantastic. That's great. It's amazing that there's the extension site there and such a great influential Methodist, Wesleyan, I don't want to mislabel them, but church right there in the city that you're also connecting with. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yep. Yeah, it's awesome.
So maybe before we ask a little bit about your life, I think maybe right here at the top, can you tell us about your book? Because it's a brand new book that's coming out, and maybe you can just share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I have two versions. I have the zoomed out one that's strategic product placement, and then I have this one right here. I want to make sure everybody gets to see it. It's brand new. It's out with Zondervan Academic, and it's a textbook that is a history of the Wesleyan theological tradition in the United States. And the book is trying to really help to reground us in our identity as Wesleyans by focusing on the lens that Wesley himself gave us of doctrine, spirit, and discipline as the keys to not just existing as Methodists, but to actually having a vibrant, spirit-breathed future, being part of a spirit-breathed movement of God and not just a kind of institution that exists but it's no longer vital. And so it kind of starts with identity, but then it really is also trying to trace the history of the movement through all of its expressions in the United States. So it incorporates the history of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, and then the Holiness Movement churches, Free Methodist, Wesleyan Church, Nazarenes, and even includes the Salvation Army as a part of that history. And I argue that the kind of Pentecostal and charismatic renewal movements have Wesleyan kind of emphases within them and have their launching and beginnings had a part of the kind of holiness movement emphasis on a second work of God. And so I also try to kind of widen the lens to see that as a part of what God has done starting in Britain in the 1700s all the way up through the present. And so it's been a really, really fun project, and it's been exciting to see the interest that the book has received so far.
That's awesome. Yeah, that sounds great. One thing I was thinking about when reading about this book, and I'll use this to then tie a little bit more into your personal story, but as I was reading a little bit about it, and as I told you before we started recording, we ordered a copy here in the office that I'm excited to look through, that I wish we had by the time of this interview, but that's okay, is that aside from it being a great kind of a treatment of the history of Methodism, Wesleyanism in America, what made me wonder when reading about it was if you had a specific kind of group of people or demographic in mind when you were writing it. I mean, I'm sure anybody could be edified by it, but that was one thing I was wondering if you had any kind of specific audience in mind when you wrote it.
Yeah, so the book, I would say the ideal is I hope it gets adopted as a seminary textbook in kind of Methodist history or Wesleyan kind of history and doctrine type courses across the breadth of the Wesleyan tradition, which is one of the reasons I tried to keep telling the stories. A lot of previous histories that are more denominational, when they might say a new group started and here were the founders and that kind of stuff, here's why they started, but then they don't really carry it forward. And I'm sure that people, if a person reads it from a specific tradition, which everybody inevitably does, I could have done a better job, I'm sure, with many of the traditions, but I try to carry them through. But I also think for me, as I finished the book, it took 7 years, and the last kind of stage of getting it to done, it really became more of a burning passion in me that I just have a sense that there's massive shifts and changes happening in many parts of the Wesleyan family. And that one of the really important things that needs to happen is a kind of regrounding in our identity, that people really need to know what it means to be Wesleyan in order to be able to move faithfully forward into God's future. And so that's kind of my hope, is that it like fortifies and strengthens people in a sense of confidence. Like, I know who a Methodist is, I know how to name or describe it, and I'm proud to be one and excited to carry that forward.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. So moving away from the book for a little bit, although I'm sure we will work our way back there, wanted to hear a little bit more about your story. And one way that we really start these interviews and kind of start talking about that is just about the sense of calling. So if you could, can you kind of describe in your own words what you would say is your sense of calling, and then maybe also where and when you started to first kind of discern and sense that sense of calling?
Yeah, so for me, there's kind of three movements. And so I'll kind of actually start at the end of your question because it relates to the first movement. And that was, I actually went on a mission trip when I was in college with high school students. It was like a spring break mission trip to Mexico. And over the course of that trip, I had friends in college who went skiing in the mountains in Colorado that spring break. And I had other friends who went to the beach in Florida for that spring break. And I remember, to be honest, I'm not proud of it. I had a kind of sense of like self-righteousness, like I'm the one going on a church mission trip because I'm such a good Christian. And on that trip, the Lord, like it's like looking back, I'd say I had like a two-dimensional understanding of God's love, and throughout that trip, the Lord like brought it to three dimensions, and it was actually like a reflection. I saw God's love for the people I was supposed to be serving so clearly, and it was just being in that and experiencing it was the most fulfilling thing I'd ever experienced. And so by the end of that trip, I just had a real clear sense that I'm supposed to serve the Lord's church through my vocation, through my work. And I wasn't raised in a church family, and so I had been a Christian for a few years, but I didn't have like a very widely developed sense of what that meant. So I just assumed that meant I'm supposed to be a local church pastor, and so started having conversations with my pastor, applied to seminary, and I'd say that during seminary, then the kind of second phase was like a more refined sense of calling to work for the renewal of the Wesleyan movement. Like, it really became like, oh, I didn't really know what this was, and there's pieces about it that are just like really exciting to me that I'm really passionate about. And so that started to kind of bring a focus that eventually led to realizing that a part of being called by God can be serving the church through theological education. So I applied to PhD programs with the goal of teaching in seminary. And then the third movement really actually has been, it's kind of related to the second, but the way I would, if somebody said, what is your calling in a sentence today, I would say my calling is to raise up the next generation of leaders for the church. And so it's been like part of what happened for me over the past decade was a wrestling with my deep love for the church and kind of almost like being driven to distraction in the places that I was, that like, is what I'm doing, is the institution I'm a part of, are these places a net positive or a negative for the church? Is the bride of Christ being blessed and built up and strengthened? And that became like more and more of a desire for me. And so I've been, just kind of looking for like, how is it, where's the right place with all this change and shifting that's happening? And the truth is, for a long time, being at Asbury Seminary was my dream job. And we just kind of had a sense of calling really to be in Tulsa. And it felt initially like, well, those two things just are at odds with each other. They don't work. But in the ways that the Lord works as only he can, he opened a door for us to be in Tulsa that was also a door to join the faculty at Asbury Theological Seminary. And we're just so grateful because I think it's the best institution in the United States to work to raise up the next generation of leaders for the church.
That's great. That's great. Well, I just want to make sure I get that right. That's crazy and very interesting, is that you already had this kind of interest or maybe calling or feeling a pull towards Tulsa, and separately also maybe a dream for working at Asbury. And at the time, there wasn't a connection there, but then with the Tulsa extension site, that kind of became an option. Is that right? Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I actually had a meeting in the president's office during an academic conference that was in Wilmore, and just was asking questions about how is Asbury held to its identity so clearly over, almost a century. It wasn't 100 years old yet at that point. And then that conversation to me was like, I was so fired up about it. I remember just kind of almost like, it was almost like painful. Like, I would love to be a part of this place. And I remember walking around campus, like weeping, like, just feeling the Spirit's presence, which obviously has happened before and since to large groups of people. And I tried to sort of like plant seeds with my family and different things like that. And it was just interesting because like striving to try to figure out a way to force the issue to get us to Wilmore just never worked. And there was actually even a time I applied for a job several years ago that would have landed us in Tulsa through Asbury, and the timing just wasn't right. But the sort of sense of both of those things, I would say, kind of was like building together. But there came a moment before I was hired by Asbury where my wife and I just had, in a way that we'd never had before, we just had a really clear sense like we're supposed to be in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so we were kind of like moving towards that one way or another. And as we got really clear about that, the Lord also then pretty quickly opened a door for us to be at Asbury, which was such a blessing. And then ironically, the church that I'm the scholar in residence at is also Asbury Church. So they're not related institutions, but that's been fun too.
That's fun. Yeah. So you can say you are at both Asburys in some ways.
That's right. That's right.
Well, yeah.
That's right.
Then there's the university, so there's a lot of Asburys, I guess.
Yeah, there are.
Yeah. That's great. That's amazing. You talked a little bit about that time on a mission trip when you felt like the love of God went from being 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional. Can you talk about that apart a little bit more again, but more specifically, what led you from that moment, that kind of time of experiencing God's love, to then your first step into the academics and to going on this path that you're on now?
Yeah, for me, like when I said it was reflective on that mission trip, I remember the way I'd put it in retrospect, of course, is that it's like I knew intellectually about the love of God, and I knew intellectually that that was related to me, was connected to me, and I had real faith in Jesus. But the like third dimension felt like it was like I felt God's love for these kids that I was basically just playing with all day. I was not a great builder, or, the people that were overseeing our work kept tearing down the walls I was building. So eventually it seemed good to them and the Holy Spirit for me to just try to play soccer with the kids, and the construction went forward a lot more quickly at that point. And so I just remember just being like overwhelmed by the Lord's love for these kids. And then it was kind of just like one of the evenings when I had some time to be alone by myself and prayer with the Lord. It was like the Lord just kind of was like, yeah, I do love those kids that much, and that's how I feel about you. And it was like just a deeper awareness of like the goodness of God, and experiencing and not just understanding but feeling, kind of head and heart sort of being fully synced up. And there was in that like a sense of like the goodness of God, and things that I had been kind of wondering about, direction of my life and stuff. It's like it all just became clear. Like it's about the church. It's about serving the church that makes the love of God real for the world, that is, makes it concrete and incarnate. And so for me, that was like the first step. And then when I was in seminary, friends would like pretty regularly say, you're going to be a seminary professor one day. And they'd say it in a way that was kind of like obvious to them. And to me, it was, it felt like something that was like too tender and like precious to even like examine, because my plan at the University of Oklahoma as a student before that spring break mission trip was to apply to PhD programs in political science. And I didn't even really like political science that much, but I just kind of felt at home on a college campus, and enjoyed reading and writing and that kind of thing. And so when people would said that, it was kind of like that's too good to be true. I can't even really think about it. I also had a really wise mentor who said, if you do end up becoming a seminary professor, your experience in the local church will be indispensable to you. And so it will clarify your calling either way. And so I did go into the local church and kind of continued learning how to preach at a really gracious congregation of the wonderful people in Lamont, Oklahoma. Just as like an aside to show how sort of sometimes unaware I was, I preached a sermon called Family Matters, like a sermon series called Family Matters. And I think I was 23 years old, had been married for just over a year, and had 0 kids. And the average age of my church was probably like 68, so most of the people there had grandkids and great grandkids. And I was telling them about like how to have a family. It was just, they were so gracious and kind to me. So I'm so thankful for that. And just during that period of time, like some of the academic interests I've still, have worked on the most today, like small group accountability through the class and band meetings, and passion for entire sanctification. those things kind of really started to bubble up when I was serving in Lamont during that period of time. And so there's like just a sense of fruitfulness. I wrote a book proposal that was accepted. And so started working on my first book, and also was able to do some stuff where I was actually teaching pastors, even though I was really young. And so it just felt like there was like some fruit with a teaching ministry, and kind of speaking into the lives of the people who were leading the church. And the time when it kind of coalesced actually applying to PhD programs was I just had this one day. I remember thinking my seminary experience could have been very bad. I went to a mainline seminary, and it was a really good experience for me, a very positive experience because of two people in particular who really invested in my lives, and they pastored me. They were my pastors during the time that I was in seminary, and those two people, just it was like a huge crucial role for me, and it would have been a very different experience otherwise. And that just like it was like one day it just popped into my head, like my calling is to pastor seminary students while they're preparing to become pastors. And it was just like as soon as I kind of received that phrase, it felt like I had permission to apply to PhD programs, and then just see like I knew every step of the way the odds were against me, and so it was just kind of like, Lord, if this is of you, open the door, and if it's not, then I love the church and I'll keep going.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. That's really interesting to hear how that your experience in the church in those years was kind of the seed for some of the work you ended up doing around discipleship, class meeting and band meetings and things like that, which you touched on already, but I wanted to ask a little bit more about, because I think some people can think seminary or PhD work, upper level education can be so kind of divorced from, I'm quoting somebody here, maybe like actually doing the ministry, or there's
Mm-hmm.
tropes about seminary. Isn't it more like cemetery? You go and you learn a bunch of dead doctrine and so on and so forth. Now, I will say I have not experienced that as a student at Asbury at all. But that's the kind of idea. And I think that there
Yeah.
can still be a little bit of a threat to focus a lot on the theology or the kind of philosophy of things and neglect the practice, or vice versa. So in your
Mm-hmm.
life, being somebody who's a seminary professor now and having the education that you have had, but you've written books on band meetings and class meetings, and that's something that's really important to you. How do you make sure that separation doesn't exist in your own life, in your own work? That the doctrine and the important theology isn't divorced from the practice and the ministry.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first piece is just to maintain an awareness that I'm not special. Like that can happen to anybody, and it's actually the most dangerous part is I think it's pretty easy for it to happen to people. One of the things I say to students a lot is don't stop doing the things that you were doing that are the reason you applied to seminary. Like you were called into ministry most likely because you were actively involved in the life of a local church, because you were enjoying spending time in the scriptures, and you were cultivating a prayer life. You had a relationship with God that you were tending to. And so don't stop doing that when you're in seminary, lest you know a bunch of stuff, but you have lost like the relationship, with the one that you're learning about. And the same is true for, in every stage of life. It's easy to get distracted and lose track of what your priorities are. And so I try to think a lot. I talk about it sometimes and teach on, the way to really measure what your priorities actually are is how you spend your time and your money. And so is the way that you're spending time in alignment with the words that you profess with your mouth, or are they at different purposes at odds with each other? And I'm not perfect at that by any means. But it has been very important for me to fight to maintain rhythms of spending time daily in reading the Word of God, and spending time in the Lord's presence and prayer, and listening for His voice. And it's been, I think, probably most underrated because it's sort of people take it for granted, but it has been essential to me to be, for me and my family, to be actively involved and consistently involved in the life of the local church. For us in particular, during our time in Georgia, where we lived for 7 years, I remember us really wrestling with as my son became really interested in baseball and had the opportunity to join a travel team. Like we just had to pre-decide that kind of no matter how exciting the opportunities were to him and then to us, because it's fun to see your kids get good opportunities, that we were going to say no to anything that asked to be put in front of worship on Sunday morning. And there were times where that was hard because like he was on the all-star team one year and we just had to say it's like literally we had to say to the coach, he can do this if it's okay if he never plays, until church is over on Sunday. And we understand if that means you don't want him on the team. And that coach was very gracious and it worked out. And by the grace of God, James actually never missed a game, but we didn't know how the coach would respond either. So it was hard in the moment. So for me, those are like telling that detailed story just because that's an example for me at that moment in my life with my own kid. That felt like a genuine sacrifice that could have been really painful. And he might have been really mad at me for it too. But I also wanted him to see that this is how much my faith means to me so that when he leaves our house, that hopefully he sees that that was a real faith for us and that it is more likely for him to have marked him so that it's real in his own life as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Yeah, that's a great point that there's sacrifice involved, especially when you have family and you're trying to keep guard over their spiritual formation and their discipleship too. Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And going back to your family and also going back to your life story a little bit. So you talked previously about being at seminary in a mainline school. That's when you kind of first started to discern, I'm called to pastor seminary students as they're getting ready to go out and be pastors themselves. What did that next stage of life look like for you after you kind of felt that calling and you're in seminary and the next stage of life stepping out into your ministry? What did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, are you asking about when I was pastoring in the local church or when I started my PhD program?
Oh yeah, great question. Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
So the seminary experience you mentioned earlier, when you were under those two mentors that really mentored you, was that your PhD seminary experience, or was that your MA?
That was in my Master of Divinity.
Master of Divinity. Okay, yeah. So then, start from there. How did that starting to discern that calling of pastoring seminary students, did that lead to your PhD? And what? Yeah, I guess both sides. How did you start to discern to do PhD work? What did pastoring look like? What did your calling look like in that stage of life?
Yeah, so I mean, part of the mentoring that I got in seminary in my master's level education was it was the first time I was ever in a band meeting. I didn't actually know that band meetings existed until I was in seminary, and I learned about it both in the class that I was in with Dr. Strong, but also when I was invited to join a band meeting. And so that was really formational for me because at that time in my life, seminary was a pretty lonely experience. I felt like there was a very kind of strict culture there that I don't know that people even intended, but as someone who didn't fit it very well, there was just a lot of stuff that I just didn't understand. It didn't make sense to me. And sometimes my peers would unintentionally say things that were very, to me, harsh and critical of people I really love, my family members and things like that. And so I just felt a lot of rejection and condemnation that, like I said, I don't know was always intended, but it was. I just didn't have categories for it. It was new for me, and so I think when people feel alone and isolated and rejected, they don't usually make their very best decisions, and that was certainly the case for me. And so the band meeting was kind of a life raft for me to have a context to tell the truth about places where I was making mistakes, where I was sinning, and to confess those sins, and then to be able to. It's like that was the moment where I started to turn, and stopped moving in a negative direction, began to move back towards Jesus and his desire for my life. And that was super important and helpful for me. It also ironically became the thing that one of the guys that had invited me into that group, when I decided to apply to PhD programs and asked him what he thought, he said, no one's ever written on the band meeting. So it was basically also became my dissertation project in my PhD program. So it's just, I feel like God doesn't waste anything in those kind of details. I also, and through the mentorship of those professors, was able to have the vulnerability to admit the things I didn't know. I felt like the formation in scripture I was getting at that seminary, which was not Asbury, was not great. And so I remember saying to one of the two professors that I just felt like I didn't really understand the narrative from Genesis to Revelation very well. And So he suggested extraordinarily graciously that we actually spend a year reading a chronological Bible together so that we could like actually read scripture as a narrative and meet weekly and talk about that. And that really marked me and was really helpful to me. So I think for both of those people, what was most helpful really wasn't about seminary. It was just about people who were willing to pour into my life and invest in me relationally over a period of time. And that was extremely important. Now, they are both brilliant professors. I'm thankful for both of them, Dr. Strong and Dr. Kisker. And you know, I learned a lot from them, and they've shaped me as an academic too. But the things that I wouldn't have gotten to the stage of being an academic if they hadn't just pastored me and discipled me. Um, and then when I was in my PhD program, for me, that level was in some ways more challenging because you're at the PhD level, you're starting to try to make your mark on whatever the discipline is that you're entering into. And so there you have like kind of some guardrails around you, but you're also supposed to be learning more independence as a scholar and that kind of thing. And there was a lot about that was grateful. I mean, that I'm grateful for and that I learned a lot from. But I also had a harder time. I had to work harder to realize that a piece of that for me personally was that I needed to start my own band meeting. Like nothing like that existed at the school that I was at. I went to Southern Methodist University for my PhD program, and so was able to, again, by the grace of God, I actually went to an academic conference of all things, talked about band meetings, and was on the flight back with a colleague at the PhD program I was at. And he basically was like, wanted to know more about band meetings. And like, by the time the plane landed, like wanted to start a band meeting. And so the Lord, you know, worked out those details in a way that was really, really beautiful. But it was, again, just like keeping to the basics. And the other thing I actually learned in my PhD program was about 2 years in, I was like, I'm not taking care of myself physically. And so I also realized like I need to recommit to like regular good sleep and making exercise a priority. And so at that point, I didn't have, the easiest thing I could do was start jogging. And so I started doing that on a kind of disciplined regular basis too, which was an important shift as well.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And John Wesley talks positively about making time and intentionality to exercise your body, if I remember correctly. So you're also...
He does. I mean, he'd be mad at how much I sleep because I think he was wrong about he didn't sleep very much, but I think 8 to 9 hours of sleep is better for most people than I think he usually slept 5 or 6 hours. But
wow, yeah. We probably also learned more about the health benefits of sleep since this time, maybe. So
that's right.
Understandable. Right. Yeah, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. I'm very interested in the fact that you did your PhD dissertation on the band meeting. Maybe you can just talk about that again for a little bit more detail for a second, because again, I think it's interesting that to me, seems like a very interesting combination of real practical discipleship and intersecting with higher level scholarship, your PhD dissertation. So could you talk a little bit more about that and what your dissertation was about?
Yeah, so I appreciate you noticing that, Judah, because I would say one of the things that has been most characteristic of my academic work is that it's almost always been marked by some kind of question about the local church. So there's some kind of interest and concern about what's happening in the church right now. And I've always had an instinct that our history and heritage is important for the present. Present faithfulness is aided by attentiveness and ground, like having deep roots in our heritage will help us be more faithful in the present. So the band meeting was definitely one of those, and really the first time I got to do that in depth. And what I was trying to do in my dissertation was to look at both what John Wesley himself said about band meetings, and then I was trying to compare it to the thing that I was hoping would be kind of a kind of next phase in Wesley studies, was to then compare that to what was actually happening on the ground. So there was at the time a really extensive collection of popular source material from early, like normal lay Methodists in the 18th century that hadn't been worked with a whole lot. I think there'd been like 2 publications at the time that had used these different sources. And so what I thought was really fascinating was like, let's use the band meeting as a test case for, did John Wesley's like vision for the band meeting, was it enacted in early Methodist life? Like, did people actually do what he said they should do? Or do you just have some like cool ideas and like we adopted it and it worked for us, but actually everybody else was just kind of like, oh, that's interesting, but didn't actually do it. So that's what I was trying to do, was to get as clear as I could about what was the theology of the band meeting, how did it fit within the whole method, the whole system of Methodism, and then what was actually happening on the ground with band meetings, which of course is hard to figure out at some level because band meetings are confidential. So it's not like people aren't taking minutes and then like saving the minutes of like exactly which sins were confessed and that kind of thing. But you could get a sense from testimonies of people. Very often they would talk about major like conversions or like, key moments in their spiritual journeys as being tied to their band meeting. So they were in their band meeting and some kind of breakthrough happened, or it was after a band meeting met and something happened. And so from those kind of things, you could sort of pick pieces together and, kind of start to get a picture of like kind of the whole puzzle and what it looks like. And I found that they were remarkably similar. The main difference was just that band meetings were harder to maintain in reality than it might seem from just reading the way Wesley talked about him. And so he was constantly exhorting people to keep working on restoring and strengthening band meetings, because he'd say things like they're continually flying apart in societies where they're not, where the preacher's not paying attention to them. But he'd also say like no society ever continued lively without them. So they were like essential to the spiritual health and vibrancy of a society. And I liked that because I thought that from my own experience, like the band meeting was, I would say, pretty close to like dead in terms of Methodist or Wesleyan consciousness when I was in seminary. I'd literally never heard of it before. And so for me, it was also like, I think this is like a well that's gotten plugged up that still has living water in it. And so we need to unplug this well and look at it. And for me, it felt like, I was really young at the time, and it felt like from my perspective and my kind of generational moment, like that there's a hunger for authenticity, there's a hunger for honesty, and that part of what is needed in the Wesleyan movement is if we reclaim who we are, that this is sort of low hanging fruit for our current cultural moment. And so that's kind of what I was working on, and how it, the application to the local church then was pretty easy to see, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that helps help you understand a little bit about what your work was like. And I think that is a great analogy, a living well that was stopped up, because I can see that. I mean, I didn't know about the band meeting until coming to Asbury. I didn't grow up in a Wesleyan congregation, or Wesleyan or Methodist congregation. But being here, I know that we have our what were previously called DNA groups, and we're still bands now. We're calling them bands again, but essentially a practice of putting students into these band meeting groups together for the spiritual formation, which makes me think of the influence that your work has been doing, and takes me to my next question. Do you feel like you've seen, since you've been working on this, some influence at the local church level or institutions like Asbury, the influence of kind of rediscovering the band meeting? Have you been able to see that since doing your work?
Yeah, it's been extremely humbling. I mean, it's really, I would say more than my work, it's been something that the Lord has done. I think that the Holy Spirit never was like, oh, small group formation in this kind of way isn't important anymore. I think it was more that it got overlooked for a season, and as if anybody picked it up, it would be, would kind of have the blessing of the Lord upon it. And so I taught at Seattle Pacific University for 3 years. It was my first teaching position, and was able to start a pilot project on actually class meetings, which is kind of the group before band meetings. And last I heard, that's like grew quite a bit after I left, and continues to be a part of the way that they do spiritual formation at the undergrad level at SPU, which is just, I mean, like I said, really humbling, because I wasn't there for very long. And it was certainly not because of me that it happened. There were many, many people who worked on it. But to see something that you're passionate about and have this like conviction, this would be good for students, and to see it bless them is just, it's so cool. It's such a blessing to just get to witness. And one of the first conversations I had with President Tennant was related to what the seminary was doing in terms of reclaiming band meetings as a part of the formational strategy for Asbury Theological Seminary. And it's been really encouraging to me now that I'm on the inside to see the way in which leadership at Asbury talks about our mission statement, in ways that are really concerned about, like, are we doing this? Are we bringing this to life? How can we improve? How can we get better? Because we actually say we want to, like, that our mission is sanctified leaders for the church. Like it's a bold mission to not just say we want to teach them about sanctification, but we want them to experience sanctification. And the band meeting is a key kind of piece and strategy of that. I also think that I'll tell seminary students a lot that when you graduate from seminary and you start to have leadership positions in the church and stuff, you get to a certain level of leadership and stage in your career where it becomes harder to make those kinds of friendships. And so there's also something I think just strategically about the life stage of seminary education in terms of like you need those kinds of like brothers and sisters to link arms with you that really know you and can be with you and celebrate when there's reasons to celebrate, and also kind of hold your arms up when there's times where your strength is waning, and you need a group that's going to support you, and grieve when you need to grieve. That has been essential for me and my life, and it's one of the things that keeps me going. There's almost nothing sadder to me than thinking about a person going through something really, really difficult and is truly alone. I think that's one of the things that is part of the mission of the church, is to come around people and support and care for them.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. Definitely. And even thinking about seminary, it's a time when these people that feel called to mostly the ministry, or at least to some kind of calling, God-given calling for a specific season of life to be trained up, and then a lot of them will go out to different places. That can be an opportunity for to really be galvanized and brought together in that sensitive but important, formative time for people that are kind of all being formed in a similar way for a similar reason. So yeah, I think it's absolutely vital at a season like seminary, for sure.
Yeah, and I felt like there was a time where I was really being tempted by cynicism, and the Lord kind of confronted me and was like, "Is this from me?" And it was like, pretty obviously no. And there was a specific time of prayer where I left like convicted that it was time to write the book I wrote that was just called The Class Meeting. And I mentioned that just in terms of impact, because the class meeting, last I heard, it's published by Seedbed, which was birthed by Asbury Seminary. And, the class meeting, last I heard, is the top selling book in terms of number of units that Seedbed has published. And that's been really astounding to me, because it's not like a super cool, compelling title. Like most people would assume the class meeting is actually almost the opposite of what it actually is, because it's not about a class. It's about talking about your relationship with God in a small group. But the fact that book has sold tens of thousands of copies, I don't even know what the most recent number is, but it's done remarkably well given how specific the focus is, and that it was something that no one really knew about when it was first published. Has been super encouraging, because the reason it's encouraging is it means that churches are using it to start class meetings and like groups. That's how books have that kind of success, is not just like a person reads it every now and then. And so that's been really, really encouraging to me. And part of it is like when you're researching and writing and teaching, and you have an idea of something that you think would be a beneficial thing to the church, you also don't know until it does or it doesn't, right? And so sometimes I'm wrong about things. And so it's been neat to see that, Wesley, in the ordination process, if somebody wanted to preach, I shouldn't have said ordination process, but like if somebody said, I'm called to preach, like his first thing was always like, okay, go preach, and then we'll see if anybody comes to faith. And if they did, then they can preach more. And if they didn't, then they probably get to preach less. And so he puts a lot of weight and emphasis on fruit. And so to see kind of the fruit of the interest in class and band meetings through those publications has been surprising to me and really encouraging.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So we're getting close to the end of our time here. So I have one more question, or maybe just two more quick questions. And the last big one is just what your ministry looks like now in your role at Asbury Theological Seminary, and then what your vision is for the future about how your calling will play out, or how you'd like for it to play out in the years to come.
Yeah, I mean, I'm having the time of my life. This is last night at the church. We had a night of worship and prayer and worship, and we were like explicitly saying we're seeking God for breakthrough, and we had an opportunity even for people to come and receive prayer for healing, and for me to get to kind of have those connections made, whereas I'm in a community where I'm known to be a seminary professor and have this role at the seminary, but also be welcomed in to get to pray with people who are, taking their mask off and sharing authentically about where their burdens are and what they really are like groaning for the Lord to do in their life, is just amazing. And for me, there's never been the kind of like I've never experienced like a church and a seminary like synced up in such a healthy and dynamic way as I have here. That's just been really, really sweet and such a blessing. It's been fun to see the new people that the Lord has brought here, and that I've gotten to work with. I got to have coffee with a student that's beginning the application process to come to the seminary, and just to hear his life story, his passion for worship. Like there's something really sweet and exciting that the Lord is doing in this next generation in particular, I think. And one of the things that I am really excited about is they have like a deep desire for authenticity. And they actually are really, I think, somebody actually said to me today that they think this generation has like almost like collectively the gift of discernment in a way that other generations didn't have to the same degree. So they can discern when someone's actually trying to manipulate them and use them for their own purposes, as opposed to just being for them and excited to come alongside them and see what the Lord is doing, is up to. And for me, um, I'm someone who cares deeply about kind of institutional history and what an institution says that it is. And when there's like when what an institution says that it is actually what the institution is, that's really energizing to me if it's a good fit, right? And if it isn't, then it brings clarity, which is also helpful. And all seminaries want more students, right? And so most seminaries will tell you just about anything to encourage you to apply and so forth. And for me, being at Asbury, where I've seen what it was like to be vetted as an applicant for a job and the kind of questions that my colleagues ask, and in this role, getting to also be a part of, seeing them teach their classes because I'm sort of hosting these hybrid courses at our Tulsa site. It's just been really, really a blessing to see the sort of collective, not just intellectual giftedness of our faculty, but faculty's willingness and burden and desire to pray with students, to contend with them for breakthrough in their lives, and the privilege of walking alongside people for a brief season of their lives, and seeing what they're doing. So for me, in terms of kind of the future, um, I'm still leaning into this calling to, I feel like the Lord is saying, I want you to work to raise up the next generation of leaders for the church. And what I hope that looks like is just the opportunity to come alongside people kind of one year after another, for whatever the season is that is helpful for them. Sometimes it's just during seminary, and sometimes it's beyond that. Um, I've found it to be really life-giving to have chances to give away ministry, to be able to coach and support and mentor and build up. I thrive when I have spaces to tell the truth about what I really see happening. And I think when you have the relational connectedness to be able to do that in the context of relationship, to say, this was awesome, I think there's some room for improvement here and we can work on this, where if the person believes it's for their good, I think I see a hunger in Gen Z for kind of mentorship and discipling, and there hasn't been anything more fulfilling in my ministry than getting to kind of like come alongside someone and then step back and watch them do what they've been called to do, and see them do it really well. It's so exciting. And for me, like I'm excited to see in the next generation of leaders, like who the people are that like I can say like these people are gonna leave their mark on the church by the grace of God. And I'm so excited that that the Lord has created them and called them into leadership in His church to use their gifts and grace and talents in service to the body of Christ, and to just get to see people that will be a blessing to my kids as they become adults and are attending church on their own with their families and things like that. It's just super fun. And so I just look forward, hopefully, and with optimism for seeing those kind of leaders built up.
That's great. That's fantastic. I love that. It's a great vision. I love that vision about thinking about the leaders that will lead your kids. That's great. And that part you said about the generation having almost collective gift of discernment. That's very, very interesting. And yes, similar to you, that makes me very hopeful for the leaders that are still to come and what the generation of next church leaders and Christian leaders will look like. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, Hope. Thank you for sharing your story with us in general and a little bit about your work. I have just one last final question, which is hopefully a really, really quick one. If you've got just one more minute. Is that all right?
Yep.
If you have 1 hour to have dinner with John Wesley or Charles Wesley or Susanna Wesley, you can only choose one. Which would it be?
Oh, definitely John Wesley. I know that's too obvious, and there might be a better politically correct answer, but I've spent the vast majority of my academic life reading John Wesley. So I'd want to sit down and talk to him about some of the things that I've read. And I would love to talk to him about, if he could be up to speed on what's been happening in the world. I'd love to just hear him let it rip. What does he like and what does he dislike? Because I think there'd be a lot of both, and I think he'd probably be pretty blunt about it, and it'd just be fun to sit back and listen.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Posing this question to people who are not such scholars on, one person, sometimes they might have diverse answers, but I kind of thought that might be your answer.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, Dr. Watson, thank you for taking your time. That's it for us today. We just really appreciate you being here. And if you're interested in Dr. Kevin Watson's book, you can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you can find books. It is called Doctrine, Spirit, and Discipline by Dr. Kevin M. Watson. Dr. Watson, thanks again for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today on Asbury Seminary Voices. As always, you can check out all of our Voices stories at thrive.asburyseminary.edu/voices.